After months of staying quiet, Gina Marie Gauthier, once the silent figure behind one of the most controversial men in modern Christian history, finally opened her mouth. And what she said left the gospel world shaken. You won't believe the kind of truth she carried all these years. This wasn't just a widow's emotional moment. This was a soul pouring out pain, a woman breaking chains, and a silence so deep it echoed louder than 1,000 sermons. Carlton Pearson was once on top, a rising spiritual star mentored by none other than Oral Roberts, founder of a church that packed thousands every single week. People saw Bishop Pearson as a man full of power, light, and destiny. But destiny took an unexpected turn. In the early 2000s, he did something no one saw coming. He told the world that hell, as we understood it, didn't exist, that all people, saved or not, were already accepted by God. He called it the gospel of inclusion. The church world called it heresy. And just like that, doors closed. Friends turned away. Pulpits banned his voice. But through all of this chaos, one person stayed beside him. Gina. At least, she stayed publicly. Gina smiled in public, sat in the front row, and held his hand when people whispered. But behind those church lights was darkness. Quiet darkness. Let me tell you, this is how pain lives. Quietly, politely, smiling for the camera while dying inside. You see, Gina came from a strong Christian foundation, one that believed in repentance, salvation through faith, and a real heaven and hell. And now, the man she loved was preaching against everything she believed. But here is the shocking part. She didn't fight him. She didn't argue in public. She stayed silent. And this silence became her prison. While Bishop Pearson became the face of a rebellious gospel, Gina became the shadow behind the scandal. She followed him to conferences, supported the ministry's downfall, and carried the weight of being the preacher's wife when the preacher was being called a false prophet. This is where it gets interesting. People around them began to notice something strange. Gina never looked fully at ease. She wasn't glowing like she used to. Those close to the family whispered that her heart was not fully in it anymore. But she didn't speak. Not then. Not even when the church world was falling apart around her. Instead, she prayed, cried, and kept asking God what to do. You won't believe how long she carried that silence. For years. Their marriage began to crumble under the weight of disagreement. Not just normal marital fights. No, this was spiritual warfare under one roof. The sermons at home sounded different. The prayers shifted. The language of love turned into the language of division. Gina tried to hold on, not just for the sake of her husband, but for the sake of their son, Julian. But when the foundation cracks spiritually, everything else starts shaking too. And then, in 2015, quietly, without any noise or public statements, Gina filed for divorce. The world didn't see it coming. There were no headlines, no drama, just a quiet legal document ending nearly 20 years of marriage. But the emotional story behind that decision? Oh, that was a volcano waiting to erupt. Gina still didn't speak. People assumed it was over, that they had moved on. But that's where they were wrong, because in 2023, news broke that Bishop Carlton Pearson had terminal cancer. And suddenly, the woman who walked away came back. Gina showed up again, but not with bitterness, not with judgment. She came back with grace. She visited him not once, not twice, but many times. She held his hand. She prayed at his bedside. And people who saw this said something felt holy in those moments. But what makes this story different? Gina wasn't returning for a love story. She came back for something far deeper. Forgiveness, closure, peace. And just when people thought they'd seen everything, Gina finally spoke, and her words would shake the church to its core. Gina's voice didn't come with thunder. It came like a quiet storm, slow, steady, but impossible to ignore. When she finally shared her truth, it wasn't just about her marriage. It was about a war, one fought silently inside the walls of her own home. You won't believe what she revealed about those years of emotional and spiritual pressure. Behind the pretty family photos, the gospel conferences, and the Sunday morning smiles, there was deep pain, confusion, and something she called losing her own faith one day at a time. Let me tell you, this is how spiritual conflict looks when it's personal. Imagine waking up beside someone who preaches something that breaks your spirit. Gina said it didn't happen all at once. It was slow. The man she married, the one who prayed with her, dreamed with her, built ministry with her, he started changing. His sermons sounded different. His prayers became something she didn't recognize. And over time, even his eyes lost the light she once knew. She didn't just feel distant from her husband, she felt distant from God. And yet, she stayed, because that's what good wives do, right? They endure, they support. But what makes this story different is that Gina wasn't just supporting her husband, she was slowly losing herself. The church didn't notice, the people didn't ask, but behind closed doors, Gina was fighting for her soul. She said that at one point she would sit in the crowd while he preached, and she would pray silently. God, help me not lose my mind. She was smiling for the people but crying in her prayers. The craziest part? She never once stood at a pulpit to defend herself. No interviews, no posts, no angry rants, just silence. Because for her, speaking out wasn't just about public reputation, it was about spiritual responsibility. She said, I didn't want to speak until I knew God was in my words. But here is the shocking part. All those years, people thought she had walked away forever. She hadn't. She was watching, praying, hoping. And when the cancer diagnosis came, something in her shifted. She knew her silence was no longer protecting her, it was choking her. Gina shared that during one of her hospital visits to Bishop Pearson, she felt a spiritual nudge. Not from guilt, not from emotion, but from God. She said, it wasn't about marriage anymore, it was about his soul. And that's when something unbelievable happened. Bishop Pearson, weak from illness, reached for her hand. And for the first time in years, he looked at her, not as a former wife, but as someone who still mattered. He said only a few words, but they hit deep. Thank you for being here. That moment unlocked something in Gina. She realized she didn't come back to fix the past. She came to forgive it. She whispered a quiet prayer at his bedside, asking God to show her the man behind the sermons. And slowly, she saw him again. Not the bishop, not the rebel, but just Carlton. The man she once laughed with. The man she once believed in. But this is where it gets interesting. As his health faded, Bishop Pearson had a strange vision. According to Gina, he told her, I see a room full of people dressed in white, and I'm not afraid. That vision changed everything for her. She said in that moment she knew God was present, that maybe, just maybe, this man who caused so much debate had finally found peace. And then came the letter. The letter was simple, just a folded piece of paper tucked inside a plain envelope. But what it held? That was anything but ordinary. It had been written weeks before Bishop Pearson lost his ability to speak clearly. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were sharp, raw, emotional, and unexpectedly honest. Gina said she didn't open it right away. She wasn't ready. But when she finally did, everything she thought she knew about their story shifted. Let me tell you, this is how unexpected closure looks. The letter didn't start with an apology. It started with something far more powerful. Gratitude. Bishop Pearson wrote, You were my first safe space. You saw the man behind the microphone. Gina couldn't hold back tears. She had waited years, not for an explanation, not for a public fix, but just for someone to see her pain. And in those words, she felt seen. But here is the shocking part. He didn't defend his beliefs. He didn't try to explain away the gospel of inclusion. Instead, he wrote, I know I hurt you. I know I lost you. If I could do it all again, I'd listen more. I'd ask how you felt. I'd sit in your silence instead of filling it with sermons. That one sentence broke something in Gina. Because this wasn't just a spiritual leader talking, it was a man laying down his pride. He continued with something even deeper. He wrote, I loved God, but I didn't always love you the way you deserved, and for that, I'm sorry. Gina said that was the moment the years of pain, confusion, and unanswered questions finally made sense. She didn't need him to change his theology. She just needed him to acknowledge the cost it brought to their home. But the letter didn't end there. Inside the same envelope was a second note, this one addressed to their son, Julian, a young man who had watched his parents fall apart in silence, a son torn between his mother's quiet faith and his father's loud message. You won't believe what Bishop Pearson wrote to him. Son, he began, the world will try to label you, just like it labeled me. Don't let them. Don't preach for applause. Let love lead you. And then he said something that shook Gina to her core. You carry both fire and grace. You don't have to choose between your mother's faith and my voice. God will meet you where you are. That line was a release. For Julian, for Gina, even for Bishop Pearson himself. It was the clearest sign yet that behind all the controversy, he was still a man searching for peace. This wasn't about theological debates anymore. It was about legacy, about redemption, about making sure the next generation wouldn't carry the same confusion. But this is where it gets interesting. According to Gina, Bishop Pearson kept both letters, hers and Julian's, right beside his hospital bed until his final day. Every visitor saw them, every nurse, every friend, every spiritual advisor. Along with his Bible, those letters were the only things he held on to. He had already prepared his farewell. The craziest part? He told Gina, don't let them canonize me or crucify me. Just let them know I was searching too. That one sentence has now lit a firestorm of debate across churches and Christian spaces. Was Bishop Pearson redeemed in the end? Did he make peace with God? Or did he leave this world still standing by his controversial message? Gina said it simply, I don't know what happened between him and the Lord in his final hours, but I know mercy met him, and that's enough for me. After the letters were read and the final prayers whispered, all that was left was silence. Not just in the hospital room where Bishop Pearson took his last breath, but across the church world that once celebrated him, then rejected him, and now didn't know how to respond. But Gina wasn't waiting for the world to speak. This time, she had something to say, and she wasn't holding back. In her public statement, Gina said something that struck deep. I didn't need him to be perfect. I just needed him to be real. And in those final moments, he was. No microphones, no audience, just truth, her truth, his truth, God's truth. And for the first time in years, she finally felt peace, not because everything was fixed, but because it was finally free. Let me tell you, this is how healing happens, not with loud apologies or dramatic gestures, but in quiet honesty. Gina explained that even though their marriage didn't survive, their story did. And that story, full of faith, failure, forgiveness, was bigger than both of them. She said sometimes God doesn't bring people back together to fix the past. Sometimes he brings them back so they can release it. But here is the shocking part. Even with all the grace Gina showed, not everyone was ready to embrace her voice. The backlash came quick. Some pastors and influencers online accused her of trying to use Carlton's death to shine a light on herself. They asked, why now? Why speak when he's gone? Some even said she should have stayed silent forever. But Gina didn't respond with anger. She responded with truth. In a follow-up message, she said, this wasn't about silencing anyone. This was about setting myself free. I spoke because the story didn't end with his death. It ended with peace, and I needed to say that. Her words didn't come from bitterness. They came from balance, balancing pain and love, faith and doubt, silence and voice. And maybe that's why so many women, especially first ladies and preachers' wives, flooded her inbox with support. They knew her silence. They lived her story. What makes this story different is that Gina didn't paint herself as a victim, nor did she attack the man who hurt her. She gave room for grace. She honored the love they once had and the pain they couldn't avoid. She reminded the world that even controversial figures are still human, that even fallen bishops can still be fathers, that even when theology divides, love can still show up at the bedside. And then came one final twist. Few people knew this, but after Bishop Pearson passed, a handwritten letter he had left behind, one that no one had seen, was found tucked in his Bible. It wasn't addressed to Gina or Julian. It was addressed to the church. It read, "Forgive me if I made you uncomfortable. I wasn't trying to destroy the faith. I was trying to understand it. Don't throw stones at people who are still searching. Just walk with them. And if you can't walk, at least don't block their way." That final message has left many stunned. Some see it as a final plea for mercy, others a confession. But to Gina, it was something more. It was a reminder that everyone is on a journey. Some walk straight, some stumble, and some question everything. But in the end, it's not about who was right. It's about who still had the courage to love through it all. So, as gospel songs play and tributes roll in, one voice has now joined the story that was once one-sided. Gina Marie Gauthier is no longer silent. And her testimony isn't just about grief or controversy, it's about grace under pressure, about finding peace when the world offers chaos, about telling the truth even if it shakes the ground you once stood on, because as she said in her final words, "This wasn't just his story, this was my story too, and I'm finally free to tell it."